Welcome! NOAA's just come out with its November 2018 Global Climate Report, and this video is a summary of it. November 2018 was the 5th warmest November on record, being 0.75 degrees centigrade above the 20th century average. The map I'm showing you here is what's called a percentiles map, which indicates which areas were setting record high or low temperatures. Dark blue represents record cold temperatures, and you'll see there are no pixels on this map that are represented by that colour. There are 8 pixels that are very much cooler than average, and most of those occurred in the eastern United States and Canada. On the other hand, there are hundreds of pixels that are much warmer than average, and we had 65 pixels on here that recorded record warmest temperatures. So I think we can conclude safely that we still have a warming world. And as I said, the eastern United States was below average. However, the west coast of the United States, Canada and Alaska were much above normal. You can also see that the area where El Nino normally sets up is warmed significantly over the year, and this is heralding the onset of a moderate or possibly even a large El Nino. Now let's take a look at what the lands and oceans were doing and compare the northern and southern hemispheres. On the left you have a comparison of land and ocean. The ocean was the second warmest on record, whereas the land was a surprisingly low 16th warmest on record. Then let's take a look at the northern and southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere it was the 10th warmest on record. In the southern hemisphere it was the 3rd warmest on record. So all of those factors together make this global report the 5th warmest on record, as mentioned before. One way of telling whether you have a warming or lowing planet is to compare the number of record highs set in a given time compared with the number of record lows. And this is what we're going to do here. First of all, for November, we had 2,307 record highs and only 1,709 record lows. That's a ratio of 3.5 to 1, and that reverses the trend from last month, which had slightly more record lows than record highs. Year to date, the picture remains pretty much the same. We have 98,000 record highs compared with 48,000 record lows, a ratio of 2.1 to 1. This is my matrix of the rankings of each month compared with all the previous 140 years worth of the same month. And as I said before, November was the 5th warmest November on record. But looking at this plot for 2018, it's fairly clear that 2018 is going to be in the top 5 warmest years on record, unless something very drastic happens in December. Now let's take a look at the upper atmosphere. 3 layers that we need to worry about: the lower troposphere, the mid-troposphere and the stratosphere. And there are 2 groups that do the analysis, UAH and RSS. In November of 2018, both groups found that the lower troposphere was the 4th warmest on record, with a long-term warming trend of about 0.15 degrees centigrade per decade. They found the mid-troposphere to be the 5th warmest, that's UAH, or 6th warmest, that's RSS, and their long-term warming trend was about 0.1 degrees centigrade per decade. The stratosphere is a completely different matter in that it is a region that is cooling. UH found it was the 3rd coolest in November, whereas RSS found the 5th coolest. The overall long-term trend was minus 0.3 degrees centigrade per decade. Now you notice as you go higher, this warming trend goes away, and I've got a plot of that now. You can see at the surface the warming trend is about 0.2 degrees centigrade per decade. In the lower troposphere 0.15, in the upper troposphere 0.1, and by the time you get to the stratosphere it's minus 0.3. But you see that there's a nice smooth progression as you go higher and higher in the atmosphere. And that explains why some folks like to compare the climate models to the satellite data, which is measuring a much smaller trend higher up. So when you see a difference between the climate models and a measurement in the upper atmosphere, you now know why, because they're comparing apples and oranges. Let's take a look at the sea ice situation. The sea ice extent in November was the 9th lowest on record, a little higher than it was this time last year, but still very much below the long-term average. Let's take a look at the southern hemisphere now. In November of 2018, this was the 2nd lowest sea ice extent in the Antarctica, and again very much below the long-term average. Earlier I mentioned that the Eastern Pacific was warming significantly, and that therefore El Nino was likely. It seems that the predictions now shown here by this variety of models have put off the onset of El Nino now to February. But if you look further out, the models then diverge quite a lot. We could have anything from a very, very strong El Nino or back down to ENSO neutral conditions by the mid-year. And it's not clear which is going to happen. Now this isn't technically a part of the NOAA report, but I'd like to throw in what the sun is doing anyway. This is the sunspot number over the last 13 years. And you can see that the current models, they have two of them, are diverging quite a lot. One sends us down to a solar minimum in 2019 and continues all the way through that year. The other one has a fairly early onset of a new cycle in early 2019. Now these are going to produce very, very different solar cycles if either one of those followed. The longer and lower the solar minimum, the likely the weaker the solar cycle 25 is going to be. If there's an early onset like one of these models is predicting, then we could have a very active solar cycle. Some of you may recall that last month I discussed two sunspot regions in the northern hemisphere that had the reverse polarity from normal and could be an indication that solar cycle 25 was starting. Now we've had another region like that, but in the southern hemisphere this time. You can see it here in the southeast quadrant of the sun, and I've blown it up here. It's not a very impressive region. It may yet produce a spot, but it hasn't so far, so technically it's a plage region. But this is an indicator that we may be getting closer to the early onset model than the long, low solar minimum model that I showed you just now. Well, let's see what we can summarize here. November 2018 was the 5th warmest November on record. We've now had 406 consecutive months with above average temperatures. We are in ENSO neutral conditions, but trending towards warmer conditions to an El Nino in February of 2019. The sun is quiet, but there are more signs of the onset of solar cycle 25. So until next time, goodbye.